There it is. How do you measure? It's a basic question. How do you measure? We're familiar with measuring things like a stage. In order to measure something, we have to know we start at a point and we go to a point. We can measure very precisely with the instruments that we have. We can measure distance door to door, and if I know the distance and I know speed, I can tell you exactly how long it is going to take me to get home from that door to that door. So in some areas, we can measure easily. But how do we measure performance? How do we measure growth? We can measure content, as they're doing in some of the testing. But how do we measure performance? How do we measure growth? My name's Jerry. I work with the East Initiative. And performance-based education is at the core of what we do. And measuring growth in an educational arena where you typically have beginning and ends has been a challenge. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we do, maybe not necessarily measuring growth, but at least recognizing that process. The model that we use to recognize growth in East is a model that probably looks very familiar to you, especially if you have worked or you're related to the industry or businesses, and that it is a problem-solving process that we have adopted into the classroom. At the very onset of a problem, regardless of where the students are, whether they are very young in the second grade or they're even in post-secondary, this process is exactly the same. Explore. I have a problem and I want to find an answer. So I began to explore, I began to research, I began to look at some of the possibilities. This is step one. Even in a business or an industry, if I am challenged with a massive problem, I start in the same process. I begin to look around at what are my options, what are the variables, what are some of the things that I need to pull in and consider, what's data that I might need. I begin to explore. The second step of that is begin to focus, to narrow down on the items that I have and eliminate some of those options. And I began to focus on some very specific data points or directions that we might be looking at. And then I start to pull all of those things together and develop. Connecting all of those dots from where I started and I gathered and I narrowed it down and I start assembling what I think is going to be a solution to my problem. And then the outcome, the deliverable. And the interesting thing, especially in education, about the deliverable is the deliverable doesn't have to be a tangible product. What we have experienced is, in East, if students simply develop a possible solution to a problem, that's a deliverable. They don't have to go all the way through the implementation and actually solve it. If they just pitch a possible idea, that's a deliverable. And so there are multiple steps in this last part and deliverable that can fall very short of a tangible product. On the outside, on the outer ring, is kind of a general process that we look at of some of the things that are going on with our students. At the very top, in that exploring and that focus, it's more of the learning, it's more of that expanding the horizon, more of the awareness of some of the things that are out there. They're working on things perhaps they have never worked on before, and they're beginning to see things. Their perspective is beginning to change. And then they begin to gain value, capital. They're gaining value, not of just what they are learning, but how they're working with one another, how they're able to filter through all of those resources, how they're able to sit down and understand problem solving, frustration, failure. And that's gaining value of what they're able to put into not just their problem, but also into their lives, be they young or they're old. And then that application. Working with those real-world problems, as we've heard a lot this week here, and applying that and seeing the possible outcome that is there. But this concept of problem solving, this concept of project-based and problem-based has its challenges. And that is, if you're not engaged in it, it can be painful. The illustration on the screen very well could have been me in grades 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I wasn't really engaged. If you are inserted into a performance-based area and you don't enjoy it, nothing great is going to come. If you're inserted in high school and you are forced to be in band and you can't stand music, it's not going to be pretty for anyone involved. So this concept of engagement is also crucial. How do you measure engagement? Something else I want to visit with you about, and this is an instrument that we are working with a school out of Columbus, Ohio, called Wellington. And they've called it the Wellington Engagement Index. It's pretty simple, but it has greatly helped us in identifying students to where this concept is working. This problem-based, this performance-based environment is working. The Wellington Index is a very basic metric, a very basic matrix with 4 quadrants. And these quadrants are identified, and when these quadrants are identified by these individuals, I've been around a while, I absolutely fell in love with how they identified what's going on in the classroom. The way the matrix works is on the right-hand side, students love it, and on the opposite end of that, they don't love it. They hate it. They dislike, whether it's content or an activity or even a project. They love it or they hate it. The other line is they are either challenged or not challenged. And so this matrix allows students to give feedback of where they are. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So not only did they identify just the matrix, but they then went back and identified what's going on with this student. In one quadrant in the lower left, if a student does not enjoy what is going on and they are not challenged whatsoever, they're bored. I don't like it. I'm not challenged. I'm wasting my time. I'm bored. The other matrix at the very top, they are challenged. There are some challenges, but they're really not that interested. I called that world lit. It's something that I need, but I'm really not enjoying it, but it's important and I need to do it. I'm just going to grind it out. It's good for me. On the bottom right, if they love it, but they are not challenged, they're entertained. There's no challenge whatsoever, but they absolutely love it. They may not be gaining a lot as far as growth, as far as value, but they absolutely love it. They're entertained. And that leaves the top right quadrant. When a student is challenged and they absolutely love what is going on, that's where engaged falls in. They love it and they are challenged. That's where they are engaged. And using that quadrant, a very basic app was created. And each student has a login. And each student, whether it's at the beginning of the class, the beginning of a semester, maybe there's a new direction that the teacher has decided, the students log in and put a dot of where they are. They put a dot. Here's where I am with this class. Here's where I am with this subject. Here's where I am with this school. Here's where I am, whatever it is that they're wanting to measure. The students log in and put a dot. Wellington put some parameters around these dots. I had already gained quite a bit of a respect for what they were doing with this measurement tool. But I gained even more when they talked about some of the parameters that they had. As we look at some of these dots, this is one of our East classrooms. Pretty proud of those dots. We've been testing it a little bit. But you will see on the far right-hand side, there actually is a dot in the very lower left-hand corner. That student is not doing well at all in this environment. So using this illustration, some of the parameters that Wellington has come out with, they said the dots are sacred. The dots are sacred. Don't mess with the dots. That teacher does not need to know who that dot is. We do not want to influence where the students are putting these dots. Administration can see what's going on. Administration can see who that student is. But thou shalt not approach a student and bring up the dots. The dots are sacred. And having this data, all sorts of matrix, all sorts of analysis can be run. We can follow entire groups of students, the 9th grade and the 10th grade. We can see that they're doing very well, but they're having one issue, perhaps with one teacher. And we can see that teacher may be having issues in all of the classes, or maybe it's just this one group. So we've got that data, and all sorts of analysis can be run. And this gives students a voice. This gives students the opportunity to express, here's where I am. Can they lie? Sure. They can fake it? Sure. But they also begin to understand the value that this imposes upon the school and the district. And with with that data, we can do all sorts of graphs and pie charts and see who's where and what's working and not working, and all sorts of things can come from having those dots. And it takes seconds. Start of the class, the teacher says, after roll call, dot day, do your dots. And 30 seconds later, they move on. Done. And they can call that any time that they need it. Maybe a specific time that the schools wants dots, and maybe a time that, as we said, the teacher is just wanting to try something. Hey guys, we're going to try something at the end of the class. I want your feedback. Let me know if it worked. At the end of the class, 30 seconds before the bell rings, give me a dot before you leave. And we pull that up and we look at it. Some interesting things can happen. And also an interesting analysis came out of this. Anyone can tell me what's going on there. This is the 12th grade on a timeline. What happens after Christmas with seniors? Senioritis. It's visible. It's visible that starting in February and March, there is a downturn extremely between loving it and challenged. Their engagement goes down drastically. These are a couple of the things that we use in East to not measure growth and performance, because it doesn't have a definitive beginning and a definitive end. But it does allow us to at least recognize where students are. And then we have the capacity of recognizing whether or not this environment is working. And in East, that environment is heavily influenced by that teacher, as well as many other things. But between these two different instruments, we're able to at least have some measurement or some understanding of where those students are and where that entire program is via either the growth model that we're working with or the Wellington Index that the guys in Columbus have created. Here's some contact information if you're interested in either one of these. Happy to share this information with you. If you just want to come visit me on the side over here. Thank you very much. Thank you.